The sun had barely begun its descent over the sea, casting elongated shadows on the calm waters surrounding the island of Rhodes. The usual sound of footfalls on the stone path drew Tiberius's attention. His days had fallen into a steady rhythm, each morning marked by the arrival of dispatches, letters from Rome, news from across the empire, delivered to the island's small port. Most were routine, the ebb and flow of power continuing, even in Tiberius's absence. But today, something felt different. A solitary figure approached, bearing a scroll sealed with the insignia of Lucius Aelius Sejanus. Tiberius's finger grazed the seal, breaking it open without hesitation. His eyes flicked across the parchment, noting the familiar hand, precise and methodical, the hallmark of his trusted Praetorian prefect. But as his gaze moved further down, something in him froze. Castor, Tiberius's son, and Germanicus Gemellus, one of his grandsons, both lay near death. And the dispatch was dated 3 weeks prior. The words settled heavily on Tiberius as the distance between Rome and the island of Rhodes suddenly felt worlds apart. Tiberius leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He struggled to reconcile the delay with the urgency of the situation. The thought that Castor and his son might already be dead struck Tiberius like a blow. Rome, gripped by the ambitions of Agrippina and her son Nero, could even now be on the edge of chaos. The following morning, as Tiberius hastily prepared to depart for Rome, the usual dispatches arrived. One, having travelled a different route, had taken only 10 days to reach him. This dispatch revealed that Tiberius's son had indeed recovered, but the dispatch also contained condolences on the loss of his grandson, Germanicus Gemellus, who tragically had succumbed to the plague. And so Tiberius made a decision. By the time word arrived from Sejanus that his grandson was sick, the boy was already gone. There was too much unpredictability inherent in communications with Rome, especially from such a remote location. Confident that his son still held the reins of government and that Sejanus still commanded the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, Tiberius decided it was time to move closer to Rome. From one of his villas on the island of Capri, Tiberius would be close enough to Rome that news would not take 3 weeks to reach him. After sending a dispatch of his own, informing Sejanus, Castor, and the Senate to redirect his communications to the island of Capri, Tiberius continued with his preparations to leave Rhodes. The familiar salt air of the Tyrrhenian Sea greeted Tiberius as he stepped onto the rocky shores of Capri, inhaling deeply. The island, far more isolated than the bustling streets of Rome, was close enough to react to any arising emergency. His journey had been long, and the month at sea had taken its toll. Yet, as Tiberius walked into his villa atop the cliffs, the weight of Roman affairs bore down on him once more. Capri would be no quiet retreat. His first steps within the villa were met by the rustling of parchment. Dispatches piled high on a table awaited him, letters, reports, and the usual flow of information from Rome. The sight of them gave him pause. Knowing that his son Castor had been handling the day-to-day governance in his absence reassured him, but it also gave him a sense of unease. Was Castor ready to undertake such a weighty responsibility? His first days on Capri passed in a blur of preparations, the villa coming to life with the arrival of more messages from Rome. Tiberius's mornings became a whirl of reports, each letter a reminder that even from afar, the affairs of state would not be still. His eyes flicked over the first dispatch of the day, a report on the ongoing trials Castor had overseen. The content was grim, charges of conspiracy, betrayal, and treason. It was always treason. Tiberius's fingers hovered over one dispatch in particular. His eyes narrowed as he read the details. Castor had managed the situation, but had he handled it with the caution required? Or had he, who should have recused himself from the case to begin with, moved too quickly, giving the Senate the opportunity to overstep its authority? His name was Priscus, a poet once commissioned by Tiberius himself to compose the panegyric for his adopted son, Germanicus. Those very verses had echoed through the Senate chamber, read aloud by Tiberius before his departure from Rome. At a lavish dinner party hosted by Gaius Petronius, Priscus found himself among a small but influential gathering. As the wine flowed and conversation turned to art and politics, Priscus was asked about his current work. He answered without hesitation. Hoping to win another commission from Tiberius, Priscus had composed a panegyric for Castor, whom all of Rome knew had fallen deathly ill. Encouraged by murmurs of interest, he agreed to a reading. In the glow of lamplight, surrounded by the guests of Petronius, Priscus recited the verses he had crafted in Castor's honour. But one among the audience was not moved. Decimus Hatarius Agrippa, a senator, and Castor's first cousin, his mother the full-blooded sister of Castor's late mother, found the poem distasteful. To him it was no tribute, but an offence. Castor had not died, yet here was Priscus, offering words of mourning and lamentation as though the heir to Rome were already lost. Days later, Hatarius Agrippa brought formal charges against Priscus before the Senate, accusing him of blasphemy against the living son of Tiberius Caesar, implying that Priscus's verses were not mere poetry, but a spell to hasten Castor's demise. A trial for blasphemy, sorcery, and treason was convened without delay. Presiding in his father's absence was Castor, the very man for whom the verses had been written. With his son sitting in judgment, the poet, of course, was found guilty of a capital crime. His sentence, death. But there was dissent. Manius Aemilius Lepidus, the same man who had defended Plancina and later advocated for his sister Aemilia Lepida, now spoke in defence of the poet. With measured tones, Lepidus argued that the death sentence for a mere poem was far too excessive. After all, he reasoned, there was no true danger in Priscus's verses. It was only an instance of poor judgment, bad taste perhaps, but certainly not a threat to the state. Lepidus further argued that the death sentence might prompt Priscus to take his own life, an act that would deprive Tiberius of an opportunity to show clemency, something he was known for. A poet's death, particularly under such circumstances, could slur Tiberius's reputation, casting him as a ruler quick to punish for nothing greater than inappropriate behavior, damaging the emperor's image at a time when his rule needed to be seen as measured and just. But the Senate was unmoved. Priscus was immediately put to death. Tiberius put down the scroll, the weight of the report pressing heavily on his mind. Priscus, an unknown poet, condemned to death by the Senate for nothing more than composing verses deemed in bad taste. For Tiberius it wasn't the poet's guilt that troubled him, but the Senate's overreaching response, a quick, sharp verdict on something so inconsequential. Had his father, Augustus, been right all along? Had the Senate truly lost its ability to govern with any sense of balance? Or had Augustus, through decades of manipulation, simply bent the Senate into an instrument of his own will, one that could no longer function independently? The Senate had become so enmeshed in its own power games, too caught up in favouring the whims of individuals rather than serving Rome. Tiberius had long seen it, the ever-present jockeying, the eagerness to show loyalty to Germanicus, to Castor, to Agrippina, even at the cost of judgment. But now it seemed even worse. In the case of Clutorius Priscus, there had been no sense of moderation, no regard for proportionality. The Senate had been quick to deliver a death sentence when what was needed was guidance. If this was the Senate he was now forced to work with, how could he continue to trust it with Rome's future? What choices did that leave him? With a sigh of exhaustion, Tiberius picked up another scroll and began to read through it. This one was from Sejanus, informing Tiberius that he had closed ranks by aligning the emperor's Praetorian Guard with the house of Germanicus through a marriage alliance with Tiberius's nephew, Claudius. Unfortunately, because Claudius's son had died under unusual circumstances, the alliance now stood on shaky ground. Because the rebellion in Gaul was growing under the leadership of Julius Sacrovir and Julius Flores, there was every possibility that the Rhine legions, unhappy with the trial of Piso, might join them. Sejanus's recommendation: move the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, scattered around the outskirts of Italy, closer to the city. If the Rhine legions joined Sacrovir and Flores, the Praetorian Guard would be close at hand to protect Rome and the emperor's family. And so Tiberius dictated a letter. "To the Senate of Rome," he began with praise, acknowledging their devotion to him and his family, ever quick to defend the name of Tiberius Caesar. Their loyalty was never in question, he affirmed, their commitment to the empire unimpeachable. But after these carefully chosen words of flattery, the emperor's tone shifted. Tiberius let his pen flow with a litany of scorn, aimed squarely at the Senate's recent actions. He chided them for their hasty judgment, that they, so learned and august, should have so quickly condemned a mere poet to death, an act of cruelty born from nothing more than the poet's bad taste. Tiberius had to wonder, had the Senate grown so insular that it could no longer distinguish between true danger and petty offence? The poet was no threat to the empire's stability. Sacrovir and Flores, however, were genuine threats. And while the Senate, in its zealous rush to prove loyalty to Tiberius, had snuffed out the life of a helpless poet, supposedly in their defence of Rome, little had been said of Sacrovir, Flores, and the situation in Gaul. If the Senate was not willing to undertake these threats to Rome, then Tiberius would have to do it himself. And so, in another letter to the Senate, Tiberius announced that he had approved the construction of new barracks for the Praetorian Guard on Viminal Hill, just outside the city. That was something the senators would like far less than a poet reading inappropriate verses, but they had already proven to Tiberius that their focus was in the wrong place.